Good evening, everyone. I'm Governor John Carney. Thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate you tuning in. This is our fourth panel for discussion on Black history in partnership with the Delaware Heritage Commission here in Black History Month. We've had two sessions on Juneteenth in 2020 and 2021. We also had a very interesting panel discussion about the burial ground at the John Dickinson Plantation, the burial ground of enslaved Africans at the Dickinson Plantation. We're joined this evening for a really important and interesting discussion about the history of education for Black people in our state. We're joined by Dr. Skelcher, who's an author, historian, board member of the Delaware Juneteenth Association, former associate provost and now professor emeritus of history at Delaware State University. Dr. Skelcher will be giving us a really interesting presentation about the early history of education here in Delaware. And Dr. Reba Hollingsworth, a retired educator, historian, vice chair of the Delaware Heritage Commission, a wonderful gem of a Delawarean. Dr. Hollingsworth will share her experience in education here in Delaware with us this evening. We also have Pam, who will be with us all evening, our sign language interpreter for the deaf and hard of hearing. Later on, we'll bring in Dr. Lynette Edwards, an educator, author, board member of the Hockessin Colored School number 107, and Syl Wolford, a historian, lecturer, and member of the Delaware Heritage Commission. They'll be with us to ask questions and have conversation with Dr. Hollingsworth and Dr. Skelcher. As I mentioned in my State of the State address earlier this year, one thing that I've learned in the past 2 years, that there's value in acknowledging and celebrating the complexity of our state and our complex and often difficult history. I was very proud to sign Representative Dorsey Walker's bill into law, ensuring a robust, accurate Black history curriculum is taught in Delaware schools. Earlier this month, I took part in unveiling of a new public archives historic marker in Wilmington that recognizes the Abraham Shadd family. We were joined by descendants of the Shadd family, by our Lieutenant Governor, by members of the General Assembly, sponsors of the historical marker, by members of Wilmington City Council, and the Delaware Historical Society, and others. Abraham Shadd was a shoemaker and an abolitionist who lived for a time here in the city of Wilmington. He had 13 children, and his oldest daughter, Mary Ann Shadd Carey, became a teacher, a journalist, a lawyer, an activist in the abolition and women's suffrage movement. She was also the first Black women newspaper editor in North America. The family moved and were forced to move to Canada after some years here in Wilmington, Delaware. Our President Joe Biden, in his Black History Month proclamation, reminded us that National Black History Month serves as both a celebration and a powerful reminder that Black history is American history. Black culture is American culture. And Black stories are essential to the ongoing story of America. Our faults, our struggles, our progress, our aspirations, the full story. I was fortunate to join Black clergy and community leaders in visiting the newly discovered African burial ground at the John Dickinson Plantation, which I mentioned a minute ago. Back in December, we partnered with the Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs, the Office of Statewide Equity Initiatives, and the Delaware Heritage Commission to tell the public the real history of that site. You can rewatch that discussion on your YouTube channel. Very interesting site here in our state. Tonight, as I said, we're focusing on a topic that is very important and relevant to me as I work with our school districts here in the northern part of our state to improve education to our children in Wilmington. An important issue to our state, the education of our children. We're going to learn more about the history of education and then hear the student perspective from Dr. Hollingsworth, who lived through segregated education here in the state of Delaware. We have a lot to cover this evening, and so I'm going to turn it over the discussion to Dr. Skelcher. Dr. Skelcher, thanks for being with us and bringing with you this important historic presentation of the education of African Americans in our state.
It's my pleasure, Governor Carney, and thank you for inviting me to share with you some of the history of African American education in the state of Delaware. Just to give a bit of an overview of the changes in African American education in the state. The emphasis of education has changed over time from the colonial period through the end of the 1940s, which will, before the Brown decision in 1954, which we'll pick up next time. In the colonial period, the emphasis was placed upon a Christian conversion and the ability to read and understand the Bible for religious instruction. With independence, came changes in education that began to emphasize good citizenship and work. For African Americans in the post-Civil War era, it meant an opportunity to become equals. In what one presiding elder in the Delaware district of the Methodist Episcopal Church said, quote, "In the Republic of Thought, all men are created equal," unquote. Still, the challenge was to achieve an education, no matter how difficult, for it meant too much in their quest for equality. The Society for the Propagation of the Church of England in Foreign Parts, or SPG, was organized to mission among African Americans and Native Americans within the Church of England, and to provide them with an education to prepare them for Christian conversion, which was still considered a dangerous precedent, as Reverend Philip Redding expressed in a letter to the secretary of the SPG in 1752 from present-day Odessa. He wrote, "Some even of our own church or otherwise well-inclined Christians are strongly prejudiced against their slaves being instructed. And I sincerely wish that the slaves themselves, by their rebellious behaviors after baptism, had not given too much cause for such prejudice, and for the looser part of mankind, it can hardly be expected that those should promote the spiritual welfare of this meanest branch of ye families, who think but little, if at all, of their own external state." George Fox, the founder of the Society of Friends, pleaded with the enslavers in America, who, quote, "have Indians or blacks to endeavor to train them up in the fear of God. I desired them also that they would cause their overseers to deal mildly and gently with their Negroes and not use cruelty towards them." Education, in Fox's view, was an important step towards emancipation, both in body and in spirit. Next slide, please. Since the mid-1760s, Friends in Delaware were, quote, "under their verge," unquote, to provide a, quote, "Christian education to all blacks in their possession or under their care," unquote. In rural Delaware, this instruction was done primarily within households, though there were complaints that manumitters were neglecting the education of the people they had liberated within the Friends Duck Creek monthly meeting, which is in present-day Smyrna. It required of its members, like Warner Mifflin, who considered himself their guardian protector, to, in his words, take good care that they, the adult freed people, were taught some useful employment and their children instructed in the principles of the religion, unquote, that had influenced him to set their parents at liberty. Mifflin further provided restitution, or a restitution for years of unpaid service. with money, land, and education for them and their children. To Mifflin, it was a simple matter of, quote, justice and equality. John Dickinson did not escape a visit from the Duck Creek meeting. Dickinson began to transition those enslaved to freedom by first changing their status to servants, and then during this transition, he personally educated 3 children who were enslaved on his plantation. Reparations. The Quakers practiced it in the late 18th and 19th century. In 1829, Delaware established the Act of Free Schools, but only for white residents, leading to the construction of new schools for whites like the Octagon Schoolhouse. Reverend William Yates, Methodist Episcopal minister, wrote, quote, "The colored people are being charged $200 a marriage license in common with the whites. The avails pass to the credit of the school fund. Yet the fund by law is apportioned according to the number of white population. White children have benefit of it. Colored children are shut out." Additionally, before the act, there were integrated schools in Delaware. By 1860, there was only one integrated school in Delaware, which was in Newport. Not far from Dover, Quakers educated African Americans in the early 19th century. It is not clear when, but Daniel Cowgill contributed to a school for African Americans in Little Creek Preparatory Meeting that was started with the financial assistance of T.R. Fisher in Philadelphia. In 1832, a member of the Little Creek Quaker Meeting wrote Fisher, noting that, quote, "The school is now taught by one who got his education at the setup by thee. I think it has been an excellent thing for the poor people of color. They will always remember." He also reported that they could cipher to the rule of 3. Jonathan Mifflin also played an important role in establishing a school for African Americans in the Quaker Motherkill meeting. Mifflin contributed $900 to the trustees of the meeting to pay for the tuition of, quote, the colored children, which were not likely to get an education otherwise, unquote. Members of the Wilmington Quakers-based African School Society established schools for men and women. The Female African School Society held classes on 12th Street. School met on every Monday. One of the teachers was Harriet Rollins, who briefly taught there until she and her husband, Gerald Rollins, and their son moved back to Liberia. In 1843, the African School Society petitioned to the state, stating, quote, "There are several hundred of colored children in this city who, being excluded from the benefit of our free schools, remained in great measure dependent on charity for the means of attaining the first rudiments of education, or they must otherwise grow up neglected and debased, forming a noxious mass in the midst of our population." Many African Americans refused to leave their hope solely in the hands of white reformers. Instead, they taught their children themselves, petitioned public authorities for relief to do so. And for example, in October 1846, William Saunders, a barber, and other African American residents petitioned Wilmington City Council, quote, "for an appropriation for the education of their children," unquote. The following summer, Daniel Bailey and other ministers of the different congregations of color in the city submitted similar demands. Next slide, please. Peter Spencer, another educational pioneer in Delaware, established missionary schools at each Union Church of Africans that he founded, later becoming African Union Methodist Protestant and Union American Methodist Episcopal. Presbyterians established schools in Wilmington beginning in 1816 with the founding of a school for colored adult females on 6th and 7th Streets. There was an integrated school in Mill Creek 100 listing 63 white students and 4 African American students in June of 1822. I've seen a reference to a coeducational school for African Americans established by the Episcopal Church in Wilmington. Some individuals provided educational opportunities in their homes, like the Congo family in Newcastle County. In Newark, these home schools existed in the early 1830s through the end of the Civil War. Around 1860, John Congo, an African American from Newark, started a school in his home located at Corbett Street and New London Road. In 1867, he moved the school into a new and larger building located on East Cleveland Avenue. Materials for that building came from a disassembled Army barracks donated by the Freedmen's Bureau, and with the assistance from Delaware Association, volunteer contributions, and tuitions, they were able to fund the building. A.J. Congo of Glasgow, an African-American philanthropist, formed Howard Associations in the state, named after Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, General Oliver Otis Howard. These were organizations within African-American communities founded to raise funds for education. Howard Associations helped poor children pay their tuition. There were 400 members who raised $400 per week. Schools also charged 10 cents per student for tuition. I've even seen information about another Congo who founded and operated a music school in Newcastle County. In 1867, the newly founded Delaware Association for the Moral Improvement and Education of the Colored People took over operations from the African School Society and opened business at its former building on Orange Street in Wilmington. The association stated, quote, "These objectives are not, as so many seem to suppose, the promotion of any political or party influence in the state, nor the establishment of any abstract or disputed dogma in regard to the social and intellectual capacity of the colored race." The Freedmen's Bureau worked hand in glove with the Delaware Association, providing surplus field hospital materials to the state, transported by the Delaware Railroad under the direction of friend Samuel Woolman, who personally laid bricks and did carpentry work on the various school constructions. The Delaware Railroad provided passes for the officers of the Delaware Association. Not all the schools opened smoothly, however. This paper reported that Sarah A. Owens, a teacher in Georgetown, was mobbed and driven from Georgetown, where she was teaching. In 1867, Major General Gregory of the Freedmen's Bureau investigated an act of violence against the teacher in Georgetown. He wrote, quote, "One report of violence for teachers is reported, which occurred in Georgetown, Sussex County, Delaware, June 27, 1867. The house where the teacher was boarding was attacked by a mob. The teacher, a colored woman, was badly frightened, but received no personal violence, but left her school, which remained vacant until their teacher could be supplied." Almost immediately after the completion of the Slaughter Neck Schoolhouse, a local mob of white people burned down the building. This prompted yet another investigation from the Freedmen's Bureau. In the incident report, Major General Gregory found, quote, "One schoolhouse has been burnt located at Slaughter's Neck. It was just finished. The plastering hardly dry. They were about moving the school from the old church into it when it was burned to the ground. I visited the place with General C.H. Howard and Major W. Van Denlip. The evidence was very strong against some young men who were at a store that night and who were known to be hostile, some of whose professed ladies have said, quote, 'No use to build an inward schoolhouse. It shall not stand. It shall be burned down,' unquote. But the evidence was not sufficient to warrant an arrest. So we promised aid in rebuilding the house this autumn. The scholars have not been frightened away, but were in full force, over 40, in their own church, one of the most interesting schools I have visited, he wrote. And the 1890 Second Morrill Land Grant Act led to the establishment of the State College for Colored People in Delaware in 1891. Undeterred by the growing violence and opposition to African American education, and determined to assist in providing a state college established a normal school in 1897, responding to the demand for more teachers to be trained, like Jeanette Turner. Next slide. Thomas Nast drew this cartoon in Harper's Weekly in 1874. It shows a man in the White League shaking hands with a Ku Klux Klan member over a shield illustrated with an African-American couple holding a dead baby. In the background, there's a man hanging from a tree and a burning schoolhouse. In Delaware, Major General Gregory observed, "There the colored people are distinctly ignored in what school system that state has," unquote. Henry Conrad of Delaware Association wrote, quote, "I am fully convinced that the colored people have done their part to the full measure of their ability. They not only pay their school tax, but after they pay as much per month for every child that they have in school. They're double taxed." African Americans were taxed to support white schools, but demanded to have the right to tax themselves in support of their own schools. Quote, "That equal school rights be afforded us, without which the future of our race appears almost utterly hopeless. It is well known that as a people, we are not able to sustain schools among ourselves sufficient to well educate our children. To impose upon us, especially this burden, is unfair and unwise." Colored Men's Convention, 1873, Whitecoat Methodist Episcopal Church, Dover, Delaware. In 1875, they won the right to tax themselves. This did not mean, however, that the tax collectors were going to collect the taxes. A group of African American men from Odessa became so desperate for the Newcastle County tax collector to collect their taxes that they tracked him down to his hotel room in Philadelphia, where he was staying while on business. They broke down his door and forced him to collect their taxes at gunpoint. I don't think that'd be done these days, do you? In the 1880s, that state took over the African American schools to financially support them through special taxes, prompting the presiding elder to report, quote, "I'm glad to say that the day has come when we as a race have lived to know that ignorance is death, but to live we must be educated. Schools are the great levelers of the many inequalities that exist among men." Conditions, however, worsened with the ratification of the state constitution of 1897. It kind of codified into law the de facto segregation of education into de jure segregated public educational system in the state. It stated in Article 10, Section 2 of the Constitution that, quote, "No distinction shall be made on account of race or color, and separate schools for white and colored children shall be maintained." The separate schools was maintained, but the equality was not. The conditions of the schools grew increasingly worse over the next decades. One presiding elder did see a silver lining in the Jim Crow enactments. He reported in 1902, quote, "Legislative enactments under the cover of making better education laws, but in reality to disfranchise Negro voters, fixed as qualified basis education. It was reasonable to suppose that this was the poor Negro's weak point, and one of the two principal features of the contrast between him and his white brother, the other being wealth. Like the hard wind before a summer shower, shaking plants and trees, loosening the earth about their roots in order that it may drink more freely the coming rain, these agitations have sent an increased number of boys and girls to school and put gray heads and dimmed eyes to work in primers. School conditions increasingly became unhealthy and unsafe, to the point that activists like Alice Dunbar Nelson, who was previously married to Paul Laurence Dunbar, lobbied the Delaware state legislators to increase funding, equalize the funding for African Americans. She taught at Howard High School and Summer Institute for Teachers at the State College. In an article titled, quote, "Something Rotten, not in Denmark, but in Delaware," unquote, the Washington Eagle newspaper wrote, quote, "When a Negro rented a house from a white man, the taxes paid on that house went to support of the white schools and none to Negro education." In 1917, Delaware ranked 39th among the states in support of education. There was a strong push for tax increases. Next slide. P.S. DuPont joined the lobbying efforts. Together, they convinced the legislature to pass the new school code of 1919, allowing voters to raise taxes to improve their schools. The white voters of Delaware, however, would not raise their taxes, knowing that an equal proportion would go to the African American schools. Understanding this, DuPont moved forward by commissioning several studies on the state of African American schools and education throughout the state. They made recommendations to essentially replace all of the Delaware Association schools and to consolidate schools with few students. They also looked at the school attendance, which was low. Many children worked as migrant farm workers or were in families that were. This limited their school attendance, especially when there were work requirements, which future legislation required mandatory school attendance. PTAs were organized throughout the state to raise funds for the African American schools, since there was a match required to assist in the construction of the DuPont schools. DuPont hired James O. Batali as the school architect. Altogether, DuPont spent roughly $2.5 million, including $168,000 for State College through the Delaware Citizens School Auxiliary Association School Foundation for African American schools. By constructing new schools for African Americans, DuPont hoped to embarrass the white citizens who he thought would then raise their taxes to build new white schools, since he had already done so for African Americans. It did not embarrass them. Therefore, he funded the construction of new schools for white Delawareans, spending a total of close to $10 million for both white and African American schools by the end of the 1920s. During the 1920s, Delaware passed additional new school codes allowing for taxes to support schools. Eventually, after DuPont was appointed tax commissioner, he started collecting taxes owed by corporations and which generated a surplus. As tax commissioner, he collected and expended one more penny per African American student than was spent on white children by 1935. Even though salaries for African American teachers lagged behind by 10% during his tenure compared to white counterparts statewide, this was a dramatic improvement from 1917 to 1918, in which they earned 55% less. The exception was in Wilmington, where African American teachers actually earned more than their white counterparts. This picture shows the Delaware Association School and its poor condition, and the new DuPont school in Blanca, in Delaware, not far from Dover and Smyrna. Schools were located in the center of African American populations to avoid any negative reactions that they might have from white people if the schools were in a different location, as they did in Dover and in Camden, Wyoming. George Lundgren in Wyoming wrote to DuPont informing him of his concerns about the location of Paul Lawrence Dunbar School. He wrote, "The presence of a colored school will mean the founding of a colored colony, thereby sadly depreciating property values, and already there is a considerable degree of friction existing between the white and colored children because of the proximity of their schools. Star Hill is an ideal location, and transportation could be paid for with less burden to the taxable of the state than the maintenance of 2 new schools." In Dover, Mrs. Nolan Steele complained to DuPont about the location of the Booker T. Washington School. She wrote, quote, "I have a little matter to bring before you. We own the farm that adjoins the ground on which the colored schoolhouse stands here in Dover. My own 2 little boys, 7 and 11 years of age, walk into Dover School every morning, and they are compelled to meet the road full of Negro children. Partly on account of this, we put our farm in the agent's hands for sale. 2 or 3 different parties have been out to look at the place, and because of the Negro schoolhouse, would not have it at any price. You see, it not only causes depreciation in the value of our property, but knocks the sale of it entirely." She went on to request that DuPont buy her property since she could not sell it, resulting from the location of the new school. DuPont responded by politely declining. Schools opened by the 1920s. Over 80 new DuPont schools were opened. Children wrote poems praising DuPont. There was even a DuPont Day. They had the brand new movable chairs. They had Victrolas, pianos. They learned sanitation. Parents through the PTA brought hot meals in to serve them. By the beginning of the 1940s, education in general fell into a state of neglect, with many of the DuPont schools falling into disrepair. The State College also closed the State College Preparatory School, leaving Howard High once again to be the only 4-year high school in Delaware. All of which set the stage for the NAACP to take action, which we'll discuss at our next session. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Dr. Skelcher, that was excellent. Really, really good. I know I'm not supposed to ask questions. We've got 2 others on here that will ask questions after Dr. Hollingsworth's presentation, but I'm interested if your research, there's any indication of the number of students that were educated in the mostly church and Quaker-driven opportunities pre-Civil War. I know from reading the Delaware Heritage Commission book, Delaware During the Civil War, indicates that there are 20,000 free Africans in Delaware in 1860, 1,700 enslaved Africans at the same time. So you have a lot of free Africans. And were they being educated? I guess the question is, what percentage of the population was finding a way to get educated?
A very, very small portion. With the 1829 school law, public education opportunities for African Americans essentially ended. So it depended upon religious groups and private organizations. I saw by 1860, there were roughly 6 schools available for African Americans, 2 in near Little Creek, 1 in Newport. Odessa had a school. There were various places. Newport was an integrated school, interesting enough. And I believe there were about 160 students enrolled at that time. After the Civil War, the Delaware Association did keep records of school attendance, and I don't have all those numbers in front of me, but there was a substantial number of students being educated through the Delaware Association. Of course, it's very insignificant compared to the overall population and others being educated. But it was quite a challenge. But there were some opportunities for that. And of course, if you wanted to get beyond the sixth level, that was a challenge because you would have to go to another place for 10th grade, and for high school it was very difficult. So the numbers decreased as it went up.
And for the DuPont schools era, was there public state funding involved in those schools as well, or completely funded by Mr. DuPont?
The construction of the buildings, those were funded by DuPont. The keeping them in operation, those were tax supported. And when he became commissioner, that's when he started collecting taxes and making sure they got fairly distributed at that time. That led to some equity, actually, bringing some equity. But the school still remains segregated.
Well, it does seem there's one constant there, and people don't want to pay school taxes. That hasn't changed. Next up, we have Dr. Hollingsworth, Reba Hollingsworth, who's a retired educator, historian, vice chair of the Delaware Heritage Commission. And Delaware Heritage Commission really does great work for our state, and we expect much more from them and the chair and vice chair, Dr. Hollingsworth. We appreciate everything that you do, and I've heard part of what I think you're going to present tonight. Some of it is hard to hear, but it's important that folks know the experience of somebody who attended segregated schools here in Delaware. I would say in the 30s and 40s, if my math is right. We're delighted, Dr. Hollingsworth, to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Governor Carney. I appreciate the invitation. And I will try to tell you some of my experiences as a colored person, going through what we were called during the time, as a Negro, as a Black, as an African American, who was born, bred, christened, and wed in Milford, Delaware, during the period when there was a definite separation of the Negroid and the Caucasoid races. A time when segregation was legal in the United States, a time when the schools were separate and unequal, a time when the state of Delaware maintained by law separate schools for white students and for the three types of colored students, that is Negroes, the Nanticoke Indians, and the Moors. A time when the state of Delaware had a law that stated that colored students only needed enough education to read, write, and count a bit. At a time when the author of the American Watchman newspaper wrote that you keep people in ignorance lest they attain knowledge of their rights, withhold from them instruction, lest they become dissatisfied with government. A time when there was fear among white people that education would allow Black people to better carry out their dastardly plot to denigrate white people. A time when it was feared that if you taught Black people to read and write, it would cause them to revolt. A time when some feared that education of Blacks would lead to miscegenation and compel whites to deliver their daughters to Negro men for marriage. Now, my educational experiences as a colored student in the state of Delaware in the public schools and the colleges in the state of Delaware are not really unique because most Black people during that period experienced the same thing. Dr. Skelcher has already talked to you about the experiences in the state with the kinds of educational facilities and the education that was provided for Black people, actually through the churches and the Quakers and the Methodists who really worked together with the Black people in order to establish schools. Dr. Skelcher also talked to you about the school in Slaughter Neck that was burned down to the ground. And here again, the people of the White Men's Party actually opposed the establishment of public education for Negroes in the state. So they burned the school down just before the Black students were able to enter. The first school for Black students was opened on February 11th, 1867, next to the Watcote Church on Slaughter Street. Before 1850, there was only one public high school for Black students in the entire state of Delaware, and that, of course, was in Wilmington. Black students south of Wilmington the schools ended at either 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, or the 11th grade. If a Black student wanted a high school diploma before 1950, I had three choices. One was I could go to Wilmington and live with a relative or live with a family friend or a complete stranger and attend Howard High School. Or two, I could move to Dover and attend Booker T. Washington School and Delaware State College High School for college students. Or three, I could move out of state and live with relatives or complete strangers again. Many students in my era stopped school when they completed the highest grade that was offered in their hometown. But fortunately for me, my parents instilled in my siblings and me a thirst of knowledge and an understanding that education was a ticket to a better life. Even though we grew up in a three-room house, not a three-bedroom, three-room house with no indoor plumbing, no running water, no electricity, our parents taught us to read and to write and to count to 100 before we entered first grade. As a matter of fact, one of our favorite games at our house was saying the alphabet forward and backwards as fast as we could and counting from 100 to 1 as fast as we could count from 1 to 100. They also taught us to memorize poems and songs and stories, and we had to read because we didn't have any radios and televisions had not been invented for the general consumer. So we had to read and write and play and talk and share with each other what was on our minds. And our parents taught us what they called mind games. And those kinds of things helped us a great deal in our educational system and a lot of other things that we did. I knew I was going to college though, even though we were poor country church mice, but my mother had gone to college, to Delaware State College High School, and had graduated in 1925 and had expected to go back and get a teaching certificate, but she met my dad and started having children, and so that changed that a bit. But I started first grade at a two-room colored school in Lincoln, Delaware, that was built in 1922 by the Service Citizens of Delaware, and of course administered, as you heard, by P.S. DuPont Educational Fund. Sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1932, my family moved to Milford. And I attended the Milford Colored School number 3C. It was another DuPont school. It had grades, when I started, grades 1 through 8, and the 9th grade was added while I attended there. And the C, of course, in all the colored schools in the state of Delaware denoted just that. C stood for colored, so you had no question about what kind of school it was. The school was later, after I had graduated, actually I started teaching, was named Benjamin Banneker, who was actually a mathematician and astronomer. And he actually made the first clock in the United States and helped to survey Washington, D.C. All the Black schools eventually were named after prominent Black people. During the summers, my sister and I would help the teachers clean and repair boxes of used textbooks and workbooks that had been sent over from the white schools. With art gum erasers and tape and paste, we tried to make these outdated hand-me-down books usable. One year, our principal, Mr. Waters, told us that he had ordered some new books for our school. And when the books did not arrive, he called the superintendent, and of course the superintendent was the white person in charge of the education in Milford, to find out what the status was of this book order, and was told that it had not arrived. But sometime later, we received a box of used books from the white school and never did get our new books. So we knew that the new books were being used by the white students. Mr. Waters was a little bit upset about that, to say the least. I don't really remember having a new textbook until I bought my own when I went to college. We didn't even have substitute teachers. So in Milford, when I was a student there, so if a teacher happened to be out for any reason, then one of the students would be sent to the classroom to take her place. And I happened to be one of those students who was chosen on several occasions. As a matter of fact, the school actually started at 9 o'clock in the morning, was over at 4. So I would go to the bank on payday to take the teachers' checks and cash them, because the bank would be closed by the time school was out and they were not allowed to leave the school grounds to go to the bank to cash their checks. So you got a lot of other kinds of experiences besides education from textbooks. When I graduated from the 9th grade, I was second in my class in 1942. And I wanted to go to Wilmington to go to Howard High School, but my dad did not want me to get caught up in that nightlife in Wilmington. And since he's in his grave now, I can tell you that the reason he didn't want me to go was because his sister actually had a bootleg joint in her house, and he didn't want me involved with that. So I can understand it now, but then I had to abide by my parents' wishes and attend school here in Dover and share a room with 2 of my classmates. We were completely on our own. The lady gave us the room and cooking privileges. And so here we were, 14 and 15-year-old students, able to come and go as we pleased. We had to cook for ourselves, and we went home on Fridays and took our dirty clothes and washed them and came back the Sunday evening and started the week all over again to school. At Booker T, of course, another DuPont school. It was named there again in honor of a famous Negro who founded Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And the school pretty much was the same, except that Booker T was the one school in the state that had a different floor plan than all the others. Actually, the classrooms were built around the auditorium, and the auditorium was used by Black groups for it's statewide. As a matter of fact, if they had a statewide convention, they would meet at the Booker T. Washington School and have their conventions there. All the other schools were built the traditional school. Some of them had the partition between the classrooms that they could open up for a larger group if they needed to. The auditorium was actually where we had all of our activities and dances and that kind of thing. Well, the home economics department was down in the basement, and we took classes in little closets and storage rooms and so forth, because there just were not enough classrooms in order to accommodate all of the students. And then the next year, 1943, I went to boarding school at Delaware State College High School for college students. As a matter of fact, I was just looking at my diploma and my report card from the time that I was in junior high school and high school, but I started to bring them, but I thought, no, you didn't want to see that. So, but anyway, some of my classmates did go to Howard High School, and one of them, I think, went to school over in Maryland with some family members. But for the next 2 years, I went to Delaware State College High School and pursued a curriculum in academics and home economics. And for the first time, I actually was able to study chemistry in a chemistry laboratory, because I had all of my classes in the college classrooms rather than in the DuPont school that was on the campus there. The next year, I was there for 2 years, and most of my classes and rules were so strict that you couldn't do anything after I'd been completely on my own as a 10th grade student. And then I went to Delaware State, and we had to stay be in our dormitory by 7 o'clock and could only go home once a month if you had a note from your parents. You could only go to town twice a week, and then you had to go on the school bus or the van. You could go on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. And if you broke any of the rules, then you got demerits. And if you got so many demerits, then you were expelled from school. And I certainly did not want to get expelled, so I actually abided by the rules as much as I could. But you always can find a way to do what you need to do. I won't talk about some of those right now, but anyway. While I was in Delaware State High School and college, I did participate in activities. I ran track, played basketball, sang on the choir, was a college cheerleader. I actually operated the movie projector for the Saturday night movies and so forth. And I taught the majorettes who were thin and light bright and almost, well, anyway, I was a little bit too stout to be a majorette, but I could teach these girls how to twirl a baton, and so I did that. I worked in the dining hall and in the home economics department, but I made my money to pay for my college education pretty much by doing hair on campus. I did the students and faculty women's hair and earned money there. Actually, when I graduated from high school at Delaware State, I was also the salutatorian, and I graduated with a $50 scholarship to attend Delaware State College. And I got a job on campus to pay $20 per month of my $30 a month fee. But there were no loans, no Pell Grants, no way to get anything other than financial aid. At that time, they were not available to me or my parents. And so I had to work on campus and earn money during the school year, which meant that I always had an outstanding bill of $10 a month. And I had to go to the president of the college in order to get permission to take my exams during the finals and so forth. As a matter of fact, even when I graduated, I still owed money. And I couldn't get my college diploma until I graduated, got my degree. The president did allow me to participate in the graduation ceremonies, and I got my folder and opened it, and I had a letter in there that said, "You may pick up your degree in the business office when your bill is paid." I paid the bill that summer by working at the seashore, and I still have that same letter in a folder that I received in 1949. It helps to keep you honest and helps you to remember what you had to endure in order to get an education. We went to Delaware State and survived. I got married when I was a junior at Delaware State. And the president of the college actually offered my husband a scholarship to play football on campus, but my husband wouldn't take it, but that's another whole story. But I did end up with a degree and with a home economics degree with a minor in science. But when I graduated, there was only one position for a Black home economics teacher in the entire state, and that was in Milford. I applied for the job, was interviewed, and the principal told me that I probably should get some experience someplace else since I still had a brother and sister who were attending school there. I later found out that was not the real reason that he didn't hire me, but anyway, I went to South Carolina and taught down there for 1 year because the salary that I earned was $1,000 a year, and I taught grades 5, 6, 7, and 8. Fed all the children who came to school in the cafeteria. Could only charge them 5 cents for their lunch, but I could make more money back in Delaware waiting tables and selling cookware and working at the seashore than I could make as a teacher in South Carolina. My gross salary every month was $106, and my net salary was $101.76. That didn't go very far because I had to pay for everything, that the room and board and so forth. And so I came on back to Delaware and sold cookware and substituted and made some money that way, did hair and so forth. In 1950, William C. Jason High School was built down in Georgetown, but it had only grades 9 through 12 at the time. And that was for students in Sussex County, the first one. And at that time, William C. Jason and Howard High School were the only two Black high schools in the state. In 1954, William C. Jason added grades 7 and 8 in the home economics and the other grade levels. And I was hired as the home economics teacher there and worked there until 1966 when the schools were integrated supposedly. But at that time, William Henry had also been built in 1952 and Lewis L. Redding also in 1953. So we actually had the 4 high schools in the state of Delaware in the early 50s and 60s for Black students. I did go to the University of Delaware when they opened to Black students. They opened in 1950 and I had to keep my certificate active just in case I got a job. And so I went out there in 1952. Now that was an experience. They made no bones about not wanting Black students out here, but I had paid my money and they took me. So it was really a hostile environment, cold. They wouldn't talk to us, and even the teachers were mean-spirited. One of the teachers actually told me that no matter what I did, I could not get anything more than a B in her class. And she was also my advisor, so she would not read my thesis so I could get my master's in home economics. So she told me I deserted the field because I had taken a job at Dover High School as a high school guidance counselor. And she told me I deserted the field, and so she didn't. And which meant I was going to lose all the credits that I had earned from 1952 until I got my master's in counseling. Well, I didn't think that was right. So I petitioned Dr. Elizabeth Lloyd as a Department of Education and told her my story. And I told her I just didn't think it was fair that I was going to lose all these credits. And she said, I don't either. We're having a departmental meeting this afternoon. I will take your case before the committee. And she did, and they changed the law, and I only lost 6 credits, but the law changed so everybody who came after me was able to count any credits that they had earned, whether it was applied to their degree or not. So in 1970, when I got my master's degree in counseling, I also got plus 30 at the same time. So even that teacher who told me that I couldn't get more than a B and would not give me read my thesis didn't realize that, you don't tell me no because that only causes me to fight a little bit harder to get something else. And I always found out too that if you wait long enough and don't get too excited, better things will come your way. I really enjoyed the experiences that I had there, and we're going to talk about the Brown versus Board of Education and the Milford situation later on. But I do want you to know that there were some students who graduated from William Henry, and some of those who went to Dover High School when the schools were integrated in 1954, who actually became model citizens. As a matter of fact, I just wrote down a few names of them, and one of them was Ronnie Coleman, who is a vice president of government and external relations, and his brother Taft, who is a vice president of finance for Amazon. Penny Marshall, who is a retired lawyer from Wilmington. Troy Fennell, a medical doctor in California, and his brothers, both of them, are engineers. Deisha Hill was a lawyer in New York. Sharita Matthews was a speech therapist. And all of you know Yuki Washington, who is still a television newsman in Philadelphia. Wilma Michoud became the first female president of Delaware State University. Richard Williamson, a dentist in Dover. His father was also a dentist. And Lee Dennis, who is a medical doctor in Dover, and his father was a medical doctor. Omar Drummond, who was actually a student who, when he came to Dover High School, had been in special ed from grade 1 until he came to 9th grade at Dover. And I was his guidance counselor, and he said, Ms. Hollingsworth, I don't want to be in special ed anymore. I want to go to college. And so we worked it out so that he had an academic program and graduated, went to Delaware State College, and ended up with a doctorate degree, and was the head of a department at the school out in Ohio. So there, if you have an opportunity to do something, you can. And then from my perspective, really, integration is basically one way. It's from black to white, because whites did not really want to integrate with us. Sometimes you think it was intentional, and I know it was, but anyway. but the law really was passed, but the practice was really flawed. They did everything they could to keep us from getting an education. But as I have gotten older, I realized that it was flawed because of fear. The fear that grew from many years of prejudice and segregation. Even the school discipline law in Delaware, House Bill number 85, had its genesis in fear, that is, the teachers feared the Black students. There was a tendency there to fear the unknown, and all of us know that if you don't know something, and Franklin Roosevelt actually told us that he said that we had nothing really to fear but fear itself, and that's the truth, because fear is nothing except false evidence appearing real. So once you learn something a little bit better, you have nothing to fear. Okay, the educational system in Delaware was a pseudo-integrated system, and of course, Dr. Skelcher has actually told you how one-sided it was financially and otherwise. So I won't go into all of that, but the message to all of us was that they really didn't intend to educate us, but fortunately, you make a way where there is no way. But throughout my life, I have continued to study. My husband and I both got our PhDs in counseling. We have a story to tell you because it is important that our Black students really realize that being poor and being Black are not excuses for being ignorant and uneducated. I realized too that you have to help other people to learn, and even though we were told that we were second-class citizens, I know that when I was competing at the University of Delaware, my education was first class because I was making A's when some of the white people were making B's, which is why the lady wouldn't help me get my master's. And no matter what we do, we're all God's children, and it's His grace and mercy that has brought us how we are today. And for that, I would give it right back to the governor. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hollingsworth. That was awesome. So many experiences that you had over the years, starting with the inspiration that you received from your parents. I would ask a question there, but we have two folks that we've brought with us tonight, Dr. Lynette Edwards, who's an educator, author, board member of the Hockessin Colored School number 107, Syl Wolford, who's been with us before, historian, lecturer, member of the Delaware Heritage Commission. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Edwards first, and then Syl to answer any questions, make any observations from the presentations that we've heard tonight. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening. I'm joining you this evening from Hockessin, Delaware, and I do apologize for the frog in my voice. When the weather changes, sometimes it starts to drain those wonderful little allergies get into play. I just really want to ask the question of both Dr. Skelcher and Dr. Hollingsworth. Based on your educational experiences and professional accomplishments, what racial historical event unique to Delaware is of paramount interest to you, and why?
Brad, you want to go first?
Oh, okay. It's not necessarily unique to Delaware. Well, yeah, it is. It is. We didn't cover it tonight. We'll cover it in the next panel discussion, but clearly Delaware's involvement with the Brown versus Board of Education 1954 cases, in my mind, was significant. And what makes that experience unique was Delaware was the only state where the LDF Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP won the case, and it was the state that appealed to the Supreme Court. The LDF of the NAACP lost all the other cases. So I believe that was the unique case.
Well, for me, I want to piggyback on it because I had made a note pretty much of the same thing, because in 1954, when the schools were first integrated, Brian Bowles was summoned to come to Delaware, to Milford, and even though the Black students, the Milford 11 that they're referred to, had actually been admitted and were going to school there, some of the parents were not very happy with the situation, and they sent for Bryant Bowles. And for those of you who don't know, he was actually the president of the National Association for the Advancement of White People. I don't know, but you might look at that decision for the name of the title anyway. But he came and he wreaked havoc in Milford. And I happened to be riding through school, and they rode through Milford with bullhorns. And I remember that all the students were actually eventually put out of school, and they closed the schools down. And that really had a significant impact on all of us, because even in the Black community, and I don't know whether it was just, I knew about it, but I don't know whether it was really well known or not, but the Black families had all gotten together, and the men had all decided that if Bryant Bowles and his group came up into what they called Jimtown, we called it Uptown, but anyway, and tried to wreak havoc in our area, that they were going to use their guns on them. They didn't have to, fortunately, but it was a trying time to hear them and to see them burning crosses downtown just to keep Black children from going to school, which was really sad. It even was sad for the white families, because there were some on both sides of the issue. And the families were split because the families, one believed in Bryant Bowles, and the other wanted their kids in an integrated situation. So to answer your question, that was one of the things that really impacted me, because it really helped even when we were desegregating Dover High School and other schools, and I had this background of experience. And I was sharing with Dick today an article and a speech that I had written regarding that experience. It's the city that learned to succumb to hate and learn to love, and that's really what happened, because eventually they came together and accepted Black students. But it was terrible. But anyway, that was to answer your question that I got out there.
And as Dr. Skelcher said, we are planning on having another forum on just that subject.
Yes.
The fight against segregation, and go through in Delaware, as Dr. Skelcher, is one of the brighter spots in our history, and the decision that was made by the chancellor. And we hope to have the Chief Justice, who's the chancellor's son, on to talk about his father's involvement in that case. Sil, I'm sure you have some observations and a question as well.
Let me start off by saying that when I reach Dr. Reba Hollingsworth's age, I hope that my mind is still functioning the way her mind is functioning. May God continue to bless you, is all I can say.
Thank you.
Her mind works better than mine, I can tell you that.
Well, all you have to do is use it, and you can work at 95, 96, it'll work for you.
I would like Dr. Hollingsworth to just expound on the teacher experience. My grandmother came to Newark, Delaware to teach school in 1890, and she taught school for 15 years. And for 15 years, she lived in a boarding house with 10 other folks. And as Dr. Hollingsworth has described her experience, we're talking a boarding house with 10 other people, and there was no central heating, no central air, no hot and cold running water, no indoor plumbing. You name what we have now, and they didn't have it then. And many of these teachers had to come into these very rural communities. And they were the only educated person there, and again had to experience what most of us was called this primitive living experience in order to provide education to African Americans. So, Dr. Hollingsworth, could you address that?
Well, yes. So the experiences that they're living in. When I came along and when I was going to school, even Black teachers, women teachers, could not even be married. And they had a dress code. They could only wear a certain kind of clothes. It was somebody else always determining what you could do, where you could go, and how you could get there. It was living in a situation very primitive. And it was hard to teach when you had to run water and so forth. My teaching position in South Carolina was similar. We had a pump, and I had to cook on the wood stove, and we had no running water. They did have electricity, but it was having to cook for all the students in the school for lunch and give them, charge only a nickel and feed them whether they had the nickel or not, was the same kind of thing that your grandmother was confronted with as well, because they just didn't believe Black folks, first of all, had enough sense to learn anything. They didn't realize that it had come from a continent that had over 800 languages. But anyway, that was another thing. And I had come from a continent where the first university in the world was established. But if you don't know, you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it. But anyway, does that answer your question, Sil?
Very well done. Let me turn the question to Dr. Skelcher. Again, I'm sure he's familiar with my father taught at the Buttonwood School for 23 years. And many of the African-American teachers who taught at their Buttonwood, at the DuPont schools were not treated very well when we transitioned into integration. My father, as an example, was not treated very well. They wouldn't let him teach white students, and he went in special education and spent from the end of segregation to the end of his career teaching kids with Down syndrome. And so can you address this issue of how many of the teachers in these DuPont schools were not given the opportunity to advance their careers?
Well, during the DuPont tenure as commissioner, there and also through the auxiliary fund, he did supply. Now this out of his fund, those were his funds that he provided for teacher training and such. And there was an effort to do that, but as I mentioned at the close in the 1940s, this all fell apart. Now, some of it was because of the war effort and everybody lost focus, but still, it took a constant vigilance to keep the funding up, get it distributed, and for teachers, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a teacher strike in the late 40s, or at least an attempt to address these grievances. And in the 1940s, it came to, well, the NAACP in the 1930s came to the conclusion that equity was impossible to achieve in a segregated system. And that's where we'll pick up in the future, that the NAACP decided you could not maintain segregated schools and have any semblance of addressing Plessy versus Ferguson. That was a court decision that said separate but equal, and was legal, constitution. And the NAACP came to the conclusion that it was not, and that's what led to all the challenges beginning with higher ed and then moving into primary and secondary schools.
Even when I started teaching in the state of Delaware, at William C. Jason, they had a dual teaching salary for blacks and whites at that time. The beginning salary for black teachers was $2,800 a year, and for whites it was $32,000, which means that now at my age, I'm still negatively impacted by the fact that even though I have a PhD and have 35 plus years of experience, the white teacher with that same background would be making more money in her retirement and Social Security than I. So it's still, you're still impacted by it, even though they say the laws have changed. But nobody charges me less when I go to the store to make a purchase for bread or clothes or anything, but you learn to adjust to the situation that you have, but it doesn't make you feel any happier about it, you just do what you have to do to survive.
So I'm interested, Sil, in knowing what school did your grandmother teach at? Was it one of the DuPont schools? Was it the school associated with the Congos that we heard about in Newark?
Dr. Skelcher mentioned the school on Cleveland Avenue, which was built with the lumber from Union soldiers' barracks. This is Abraham Lincoln said that the barracks from the Union soldiers they should be torn down and the wood used to build schools. And it was a 4-room schoolhouse. And again, goes back to right after the Civil War, 1868. And again, she was there from 1890 to 1905. She was teaching there.
Amazing. And you don't know how many students were attending? I'm curious. You heard me ask this question of Dr. Skelcher as well. Attended the school there?
Don't have an estimate. Again, it was a 4-room schoolhouse, and based upon other 1-room, 2-rooms, 3-room schoolhouses, you would estimate that there would probably be about 10 or 12 kids in each class. So we'd probably be talking about 40 kids, something like that, I think would be a good estimate.
Well, it's very interesting. Dr. Skelcher, any last words? I'm curious too, after you give some last words, Dr. Hollingsworth, I've heard you say before, and you started your presentation talking about your parents and the inspiration that you got from them and the early education you got from them. And I've heard you say that in some ways, what you got, even with inferior supplies and books at the segregated schools was better than what you got in an integrated environment, and it's a debate that goes on, and I'm just curious as to your thoughts about that. First, how were your parents educated? What kind of schooling did they have? And then secondly, you talk with pride about what you received in the segregated.
Well, I thought, first of all, my mother graduated from high school at Delaware State College at the time. They had just added a normal school on there at that time because there were some changes that were made, and Brad can tell you about that from the time when the school opened as a college and then didn't have enough Black students actually to go to enrollment, and then who were qualified for college level work. And they actually had to go back and add the high school on and come back up. And I think it was 1932 that they added went back to the 4-year college again. But at any rate, they both, even though we didn't have that much education, my mother, both of them were smart. And my dad was a math wizard. I mean, he was the one who was a builder, and he could estimate how much supplies he needed and wouldn't have a handful of scraps left over, kind of thing, and taught us mathematics and spatial relations and those kind of things. And we just had to learn. We just couldn't sit around, and we could not use the word can't in our house because my mother and dad would say right away, can't. Well, can't means can try. So have you tried? And so, you didn't use that word. And they taught us that the folks were as good as the people. We could do whatever we wanted to do if we wanted to do it badly enough. And so we grew up with that. Plus the fact that and our heritage, as is true with most Americans, Blacks in this country, are not all African. And so we have some, when I did my DNA, I can share that with you another time, but we are who God created us to be. Not one of us created ourselves. And so we did have the teaching and the instruction. We were taught to treat people better than they treated us. And that, fighting, you can fight with words and earn more and gain more than you can by fighting with your fists. So those were the kinds of things that my parents taught us. When we went to school, our teachers taught us how to adjust to the situation. They also taught us the accomplishments of Blacks for every subject matter that we had. So we knew Black history all year long. And we knew of the accomplishments. So like a lot of people don't even know, if you go to Washington, D.C., that the Blacks who actually made the state building and the White House in Washington actually put the people on the very top facing the east, because that was an African tradition. But anyway, there are lots of things that about Blacks that we learned that Black whites are just beginning to recognize as having some importance. And so you learn how to adjust with what you have. And my dad said there's a whole wide world out there. Go out there and see some of it. So, we have done some traveling. I've traveled in every state in the Union. I've driven in 48 of the 50. I've traveled in several foreign countries and several continents. I've been to Africa about 4 different times. And all of these things provide a different kind of education for you and an appreciation for who you are and what you are. So I don't know whether that answers your question or gives you more information than you asked for.
Well, it certainly underscores the importance of good parents and parenting
Yes.
as the first teachers, and
Yes.
the inspiration that you receive from people like your parents and people that you look up to, and the will to succeed and to learn, and that's an important part of it. Dr. Skelcher, any last thoughts? We're really looking forward to the next session, which we expect to do on the Brown versus Board of Education era and Delaware's participation in that, the fight for equal educational opportunities. And I found your presentation really interesting. A lot of information that I was not aware of as a lifelong Delawarean, as the now 74th governor of our state. Knowing that history, I think, is really important for all of us and for those who lead our state in particular.
I appreciate being a part of this important discussion, and looking forward to the next panel discussion. Very, very significant part in well, not only state history, but national and even international history, because desegregation
Right.
led to the same efforts around the world.
Right.
Well, thank you all very much. Yeah, we've heard a lot about the early history of education for Delawareans of African descent, even though it was really just the tip of the iceberg. When you think about it, we've kind of set the table for the next forum, which I think is going to be really interesting. And as we talk about, and Dr. Hollingsworth talked a lot about the Milford experience, which was really an ugly chapter, frankly, in our history. But we do have a history that many of us don't know about, and it's important that we all know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's why I think these discussions are certainly helpful for me, and they're aimed to help create a better understanding for all of us. As I said, we will be hosting another discussion in the coming weeks, and we'll continue to do these forums, Dr. Hollingsworth, with the help of the Heritage Commission. I know you and Dick both are really committed to this, and we certainly appreciate that. So those of you who've tuned in, thanks for joining us, and look forward to look for information more about our next session. I believe strongly that the only way that we can secure our future is to understand and reconcile our past and recommit to a better future. I think Dr. Hollingsworth and Dr. Skelcher put it out there for us, and Sil and Dr. Edwards. We continue to try to reimagine our schools and what they should look like in 2022. And this year I've spent many a Saturday over the last month or two knocking on doors in the city of Wilmington, talking to residents about how we do a better job providing better educational opportunities for our children in Wilmington, which attend particularly at the early grades and preschool, elementary school, mostly racially identified schools, and schools with that are mostly low-income students. We have done a lot in increasing the resources available for these the students, but I'm committed to creating a Wilmington Learning Collaborative that gives kind of more influence and control to parents and local leaders, and encourages the 3 big school districts that serve the children and families in the city to work together to do better for all those students. Part of it, I think, Dr. Hollingsworth, is what you talked about, inspiring our young people to learn, to know that they can reach great heights, to give them examples so that they can see themselves as as astronauts and engineers and folks doing really good things, and teachers, by the way.
Right.
We certainly can do better, and we must do better. The future of our city and our state depend on that. The children and their families deserve our best efforts, and we're going to continue to work on that. We do have some good news. Each of the 3 school districts, Brandywine, Red Clay, and Christine in the city of Wilmington, the school boards have voted to engage with us in developing a memorandum of understanding around what a Wilmington Learning Collaborative is like. We are doing more community engagement and outreach to parents. We have a number of dates that are up there on the board. We're hosting a Wilmington Learning Collaborative Engagement Fair at Stubbs Early Education Center. We've converted the Stubbs Elementary School right next to Howard High School to a early education center on the first floor and a parent support center on the second floor. That fair will be Thursday, March the 3rd, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. We'll have childcare and food provided. We're also hosting a virtual community engagement event on Saturday, March 5th from 10 to 11:30 in the morning, and we'll be putting out more information about that. If you want more information about our Wilmington Learning Collaborative, you can get it on our website at de.gov/WLC. That's de.gov/WLC. Please click into it and learn more about it. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. My good friend, Dr. Hollingsworth, always a special person. Dr. Skelcher, really interesting presentation by you. Sil and Dr. Edwards, thank you for joining us as well. And of course, Pam, our sign language expert, thanks for your great work. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you for having us.